The film opens with a montage of images of a regular bleak morning in a small city in Oregon. The images illustrate the natural terrain, the animals, and the working class citizens that inhabit the coastal city. We are introduced to Fran, a pretty young woman in her mid-20s, standing morbidly alone at the beach. Like a robot in human form, Fran gets ready and goes to work. She sits in her cubicle without speaking a word to anybody. The environment in her office is extremely dull, and the conversations of her co-workers sound banal. Fran stares blankly at the ceiling, gets herself coffee, and works on her spreadsheets without any enthusiasm. Her co-workers discuss topics from technology to ships, but Fran doesn't seem interested enough to engage with them. Through the window, she stares at the ship outside. She anxiously notices the worker at the dock pulling up a crane. She replays the ropes being pulled up in her mind, and, at the same time, imagines her toes ascending, as if she's hanging herself. Her daydream is interrupted by a co-worker, who brings over a greeting card for Fran to sign. It's for Carol's farewell surprise. Fran still doesn't speak a word, but agrees to her request to sign. Later that gloomy evening, she walks back home all alone and notices her neighbor, a single mother, struggling with her daughters. She quietly sneaks into her house without getting noticed. She pours a glass of wine and microwaves her dessert dinner. She looks outside and imagines herself lying deceased in a forest. She snaps out of it due to the beep of the microwave. She eats her dinner and completes a Sudoku puzzle. After this, she gets a call from her mother, but ignores it. Her mundane day ends with her brushing her teeth and getting into bed around 10 p.m. Next morning, she walks into the office like clockwork. Carol asks her how she's doing, and Fran meekly responds that she's not doing too bad. Carol offers to take anything she might need from her office stationery. She shows her the stapler and the calculator. An old colleague asks Carol if he can take the stapler. Carol hands it to him, and he starts to dig into the other stuff available. Carol then joyously announces that she's going on a cruise, which prompts her colleagues to make jealous remarks. However, Fran seems uninterested, working at her desk. Later, at Carol's farewell, they cut the cake and sing songs for her. Fran stands in the corner emotionless and stoic as Carol gives a heartfelt goodbye speech. Next day, Fran is busy stocking up files as she begins to daydream again. She imagines herself alone in a basement, where a large python is crawling next to her. She goes back home and again eats her dessert dinner alone. Next day, she stares at Carol's empty desk, which seems to be the only different thing at her uneventful office. Later, the workers get together in a conference room for a team-building exercise. They have to introduce themselves and talk about their favorite food. Robert, a middle-aged man, and an intern bond over their shared love for Thai food. But Fran doesn't want to interact or develop any social skills. She stoically mentions that she loves cottage cheese. After which, she goes to the coffee machine and makes herself a cup of coffee. She overhears the intern and Robert taking their conversation further and getting to know each other. This seems like an alien world to Fran. But to her surprise, after the intern leaves, Robert starts talking to her. However, Fran isn't interested in breaking the ice and walks back to her desk. However, she can't help but steal a look at Robert. She opens her email and finds an email from him. He has asked her to send him a form to fill out for the office supplies. Fran sends him the form as an attachment, without adding any greeting or polite response prompts. Robert replies to the email instantly, asking her what a SKU number is. She simply responds that it's the product number. After a few emails back and forth, Robert mentions that he's never had a job before, which is the reason for his lack of knowledge about basic office jargon. Fran thinks he should have kept that information to himself, which makes Robert laugh. He jokingly asks her if anybody has noticed this about him. Fran responds with a feeble no. He mentions that he likes cottage cheese as well, and jokes that it's one of the top 5 forms of cheese. But Fran doesn't seem to be picking up on his social cues, and corrects him by stating that it's not actually a form of cheese and happens to be curd. She peers over her desk and finds him laughing. The following night, back at home, she finds herself smiling faintly. She looks over at her empty dinner plate and notices a bug. She starts playing with it. After a few moments, more bugs appear. She imagines herself lying in a forest with bugs all over her. However, her strangely peaceful daydream is interrupted by Robert appearing in it. She snaps out of it in shock. Next day at work, she smiles at her colleague, which is an unusual phenomenon for her. Fran goes over to the photocopy machine, and she is stopped by a colleague who is deep in conversation with Robert. Fran is socially awkward and watches them talk and tries to nod. As the colleague leaves, Robert turns his attention to Fran, which makes her smile. To break the tension, she tells him a joke. Robert laughs at her joke and tells her she's funny. Fran reminds him about the order form he was supposed to send over to her. He claims he isn't done filling it out, but Fran asks him to take his time with it. He thanks her while doing a Matthew McConaughey impression and references a movie. Although Fran hasn't seen it, this gives him the opportunity to ask her out for a movie. She solemnly accepts and quickly gets home to prepare for her date. That following evening, she walks towards Robert as he waits for her outside the cinema. They are both early for the show, and Robert has already bought the tickets. He politely turns down her offer to pay him and wants it to be his treat. After the movie, he asks her if she wants to grab some food, and she accepts his offer to extend the date. They enter a restaurant and get seated. He has been there before and recommends getting the pie for dessert. After an awkward moment of silence, he begins the conversation by talking about the movie. She says she didn't like anything about the movie. He finds this amusing, but thanks her for not walking out, even if she hated it. The waitress, Amelia, intervenes and assumes Robert has come back from watching a movie. Robert confirms that he did and loved it, but Fran didn't. He orders a pie and asks Fran if she would like to share it with him. She agrees and orders an Irish coffee to go with it. Robert asks the server to bring 2 coffees. There's a song playing at the restaurant, and Robert points out that he likes the song, but Fran makes a face. He asks her to share her likes and dislikes. Fran responds that she likes her job because she's good at making spreadsheets. He asks if she only likes things that she's good at. She dodges the question and asks him why he likes movies. He explains that movies make him look for something and try to understand it. She wonders if he always finds something in it. He jokes that if he doesn't like it, he can always throw popcorn at it. At this point, Amelia brings the pie and the coffees to the table. He drinks his coffee, but Fran wants to save it for later. He takes a sip and gets a cream mustache. Later, they exit the restaurant together and find Amelia smoking outside. Robert tells Amelia that even if they didn't agree on the movie, they agreed on the pie. Amelia invites them for a get-together at her house on the weekend. If they are interested, they accept her invitation and warmly wish her good night. As they walk back home, Robert makes conversation about ordinary things like furniture, raincoats, and umbrellas. He apologizes for rambling on. It's a force of habit when he's nervous. To pacify him and not make him feel bad, she says she doesn't use an umbrella. They reach her house and wish each other good night. They are hesitant to go for a hug, but slowly move towards each other. There's a brief moment of awkwardness until she heads back to her house and he walks away in a different direction. Fran gets into bed, and instead of sleeping right afterwards like she usually does, she lies awake thinking. She imagines herself lying deceased on a beach. Next morning, she is in the office trying to work and stealing glances at Robert in between. However, thoughts of her lying at the beach continue to haunt her as she tries to understand why Robert is not talking to her. As they all leave the office, she calls out to Robert. He greets her, but continues to leave. She asks him if he has any plans that night. He doesn't, so he invites her over to his house. Later that evening, she arrives at his house. He compliments her sweater, and she returns the compliment by appreciating his pants. She hands him the bottle of red wine she got for him. He is pleased to see the bottle of Malbec and gets some glasses for them. He begins cooking the meal as she wanders around the house. She notices his movie poster collection and remarks that he really does like movies. He asks her to go ahead and play some music. She looks through his CD collection and picks one. He notices that she picked out a movie soundtrack, but Fran doesn't know where it's from. He asks her what her version of movie obsession is. She says she likes to cook. He begins to show her around the house, and she appreciates it. She leans in to kiss him, but pulls back immediately. She apologizes, but he thinks it was good and tries to kiss her again. The moment is interrupted by the sound of the cooker. He rushes back down to turn it off. Later, we find them on a couch after having finished the meal. Robert is sleeping as Fran lies awake next to him. He suddenly wakes up and asks her for the time. She responds that she doesn't know, while he apologizes for sleeping in the middle of the movie. She claims to have liked this film. He wonders if there's a movie out there that she would actually love. Maybe one about cooking. She smiles and turns towards him. She wants to know more about him and asks him about his childhood. He says he grew up in a crowded and loud environment. She wonders if he moved to this town because he likes the quiet. He says he does, but that's part of the reason why. He got divorced after a short marriage and moved here after. Fran gets taken aback after this information. He mentions that he's been divorced twice. He got married young, and his first marriage lasted a long time. But with the second one, He felt it was better to move on from something that wasn't working than to stay long. He adds he still wants to figure out love and partnership. Then, he asks her if she's ever been in love. She responds that she's never felt this feeling. She starts to get a little vulnerable, but notes that she's not that interesting. Their date comes to an abrupt end, and she drives back to her house. Next day, she's at the laundromat. She receives a text from Robert about Amelia's party invitation. She starts daydreaming about her demise again. She imagines herself driving and getting hit by a car. This turns into a montage of every instance where she's imagined herself losing her life from the forest to the beach. She stops driving and takes a breather after being overwhelmed with her own thoughts. Later, she arrives at Amelia's party, who's happy to see her. Robert is already at the party, and Fran compliments his pants again. Amelia starts introducing Fran to everyone, but stops when Garrett, Fran and Robert's colleague, spots her. Garrett is surprised at first, but begins to tease Robert and Fran to glean more information about their association. Amelia brings everyone to the living room as they are about to start playing a game. While the rules of the game are being explained, Fran starts to get fidgety. They retire into different rooms as the lights go down and the game begins. They are required to reconvene into the living room when the lights turn back on. At the start, Fran seems out of place and merely watches everyone play in quiet amusement. Robert is being cornered in the game and looks to Fran for support. But Fran takes pleasure in ratting him out, which makes everyone laugh. Everyone retires into different rooms again, and Robert and Fran go into one together. Robert sarcastically thanks Fran for throwing him under the bus. Irrespective of what happened, Fran thinks Robert is quite good at the game. After this, Fran impresses everyone with her creative way of playing a scenario. Later, they all sit down for dinner. Garrett remarks that he told everyone at the office he's a vegetarian by mistake, and now he has to keep up with the lie. He's afraid Robert and Fran might tell on him, as he is busy eating the crab. He asks Robert if it's his first time cracking the crab. Robert says it's been a while since he ate one. They ask Fran where she's from, and she answers that she grew up around this region. Then they proceed to teach Robert how to crack a crab, and Fran gives him specific and thoughtful instructions. After the dinner, Robert and Fran are talking in Robert's car. Robert compliments Fran at being secretly good at many things without letting anyone know, but she dismisses it and calls herself uninteresting again. Robert doesn't understand why Fran has her guard up at all times. He's curious about her and wants to get to know her. Fran shuts him down again and asks him what he wants from her. This is when Robert finally confesses that he likes her and wants to know more about her, but she won't let him in. He directly asks her if she likes him. However, Fran gets overwhelmed and says he is exhausting, and it's no wonder that he can't stay married. Robert gets upset and ultimately tells Fran to leave his car. That night, Fran is alone in her house. She starts to cry uncontrollably and lies down on the floor. Although she doesn't sleep, she finds that all her thoughts about passing away aren't coming to her. Next morning, she gets up from the floor as the sunlight enters her living room. Her dull apartment has plants all around it as the sun peers through every room. She ventures out to a restaurant on the quayside and bumps into Carol, her ex-colleague. She looks distraught and alone. Carol says she misses everyone at the office and asks Fran how they are doing. Fran tells her they are all the same and nothing has changed. She wonders what Carol is doing here, since she was supposed to go on a long cruise vacation. This is when Carol gets emotional and tells her that her husband had a stroke. Fran sits down at the table and asks her if he will make it. Carol shrugs her shoulders. She doesn't know if he will. She explains that she waited all these years and saved up money for them to live out their dreams, but it never came to pass. She could dream about what they could have had, but she had all those moments of everyday life with him that count after all. Next morning, Fran cheerfully walks into the office with a box of donuts. Her colleagues notice it immediately and thank her for getting donuts for them. They all gather around her to eat, which puts a smile on her face. Garrett comes to her and says he had fun with her that night. He makes her smile widely when he says that he's never seen anyone play the game like her. He adds that everyone agreed that they will invite her again. Robert comes over and takes a donut, ignoring Fran completely. Fran taps him on the shoulder and asks him if she could speak to him privately. They walk into a different room. She asks him how the rest of his weekend was. He responds that it was all right, and he watched a few movies. She apologizes to him for being harsh to him, and it wasn't her place to say those things. She starts getting vulnerable and can't look him in the eye, but Robert thanks her for the apology. She adds that the more she thinks about the movies they saw together, the more she likes it. Although, he claims he hasn't thought about it much. She gets teary-eyed and asks him if he wishes he could unknow her, but he states that he actually doesn't know her. Fran starts to reveal the deepest part of herself when she tells him she sees a crane from her cubicle, and sometimes she thinks about hanging from it, not because she actually wants to, but just to wonder how it would make her feel. Robert looks at her lovingly and then gives her a hug. They hug each other tight as she imagines plants sprouting up in the room around them. The film ends with a romantic song playing on the soundtrack,